A lot still happening down in Austin as the Texas Legislature continues. The time is dwindling down in Austin. And, our next guest, we normally talk to him on Mondays, but the last couple of weeks we've been bringing on twice a week because just so much is happening. He's the editor of Quorum Report, our good friend Scott Braddock. Scott, we thought we were going to start off talking about one thing this morning, and then we have a big announcement that the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker have an announcement this afternoon.
They will be talking to the media at 2:30 this afternoon, and we'll be there for quorumreport.com. Folks who want to point their browser to our website right around that time, because if there is news, you will get it first there. I think this is one of those sort of waiting for the white smoke sort of moments, Chad. People want to know, have the House and Senate come to agreement on the big things, those being the property tax bill, the school finance bill, the budget. It's the down to the wire moments here, with only a few days left to go in this legislative session, and the big things have not been announced to have been worked out. Now, I have been telling people, don't panic. It would be just fine if if all those proposals came out today and then could be voted on tomorrow. The trains would run on time, and there would be no interruption in service.
Yeah, well, you know what I mean? and I've gotten the questions, and I'm sure you just kind of alluded to it. You've gotten those questions when it comes to the school finance, when it comes to the tax reform, when it comes to the budget. People, have been like, well, what's going on? Everyone said we were close on a deal. Well, it's happening. Time is running out. You think we may hear about that today?
That's what you would hope, but of course, hope is not a strategy. So we'll go to the press conference and figure out what they say. But those are the big questions. I mean, what's being done on the big promises that were made at the beginning of the legislative session? As KFYO listeners know very well, the big promises were what? That they would offer you property tax relief, that school finance would be quote unquote fixed. Those are some of the biggest things that are out there. What's going to happen with these teacher pay raises, et cetera. I've been told over the last couple of weeks, Chad, that actually when it comes to the state budget, which of course is a Herculean effort, it's a $250 billion document written over a 24-month horizon. I don't know if you or I could, write our own household budgets over the next 2 years today, right? But that's how the state of Texas operates.
Yeah.
And so they have to get that done. Constitutionally, that's the only thing they have to do. The legislature doesn't have to do the other things. Those other things are more about campaign promises, and they're about making good on what they have said to voters that they will do. In particular, school finance, in particular, some property tax relief. When it comes to these big pieces of legislation, our sourcing has indicated that they're pretty close on all this stuff and have been for some time. Of course, the joke in Austin is that, look, if you delay the release of the details of these, big agreements, then, and by the way, these will be documents that are quite a few pages. These are thick bills. These are not like two-page, proposals. If you delay the release of it, it certainly gives the membership of the House and Senate less time to read it and absorb it before they have to vote on it. These proposals, once they come out of these conference committees, which are written behind closed doors, once they come out and they're made public, then it's just an up or down vote in the House and Senate. A majority of the House, majority of the Senate say yes to whatever's in that agreement, and they're good to go on the budget, on school finance, and on property tax, quote-unquote, relief. Although it is interesting, Chad, I mean, as we've talked about here, on the property tax bill in particular, which people are, rightly upset about their property taxes being so high and, that pain being uneven, with people in Lubbock, I'm sure, saying they would like to pay less for their property taxes. People in Frisco or in Williamson County, one of the suburbs or one of the big cities, those people say the same thing, but they might say it more forcefully because they're, in those fast growth areas, the property tax bills are really just through the roof. There is no relief in the bill that they're talking about, or at least in the bill as it went into the conference committee, right? And the big three who are going to talk this afternoon, they admitted as much at their last big three press conference. They said that for those rollback rate elections that are in Senate Bill 2, the property tax bill, that those don't actually cut anybody's taxes, and that's why they were looking at another revenue stream, the now failed sales tax increase to try to buy down property taxes. There is some property tax relief in the school finance bill just a little bit because they're buying down property taxes all across the state, to the tune of 4 cents. So if you're, at $1 there, and I'm not sure what the rate is in Lubbock, you know it and I don't, but they would buy you down 4 cents. So if you're at $1, you'd be at 96 cents. That gets you some property tax relief maybe next year, but does that get you relief in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? Well, if your valuations are going up, of course, no, it doesn't. So,
well, and even that relief, and there have been some numbers thrown around that the only way I think most homeowners would recognize it as relief, even in HB3, is if they would, put like a third line on your bill going, hey, if this had not passed in the last legislative session, you would have paid this because you're most likely your property, your valuation's going to go up.
Yes.
You're going to have cities and counties that still have bond elections and all this, so it just may not go up as much as it would have.
Yeah, and another way to say it is that they may be able to offer relief, on a one-time basis because they have money in the bank, right? The fact that they're able to buy down property taxes maybe next year, and therefore maybe have some folks across the state see a slight reduction in whatever they paid or whatever they're going to pay this year versus what they'll pay next year. But what they're not doing, and that no one should be mistaken about this, Chad, what they're not doing is putting a structural reform in place that would contain your property taxes or cause them to go down. That's not happening in any of the legislation that we've seen so far. Maybe in the weeks since these bills went into the closed-doors conference committees, maybe they've worked some magic in the meantime, Chad, to make what I just said happen, but there would be a lot of doubt about that.
Yeah, so we'll see what they announce. I think we'll see a little white smoke today. It would put everything right on track. We'll see what happens. On the other
Fingers
side,
crossed, Jeff.
yeah,
Fingers crossed.
Exactly. On the other side, there's a whole lot of legislation that's dead, and most likely not going to be revived. Correct?
Lots of things that were very important to conservatives are not going to pass. One of the things that I know that people get really fired up about is protecting Confederate monuments, and the historical markers is something that President Trump has talked about a lot, and his critics say that he sort of ripped the scab off of some old wounds. Others say that he's just saying, look, we don't erase our history just because it's ugly. And there was a bill that was debated in the Texas Senate that did not make its way to the floor of the House. So that, as far as we know, is not going to pass. We know that the sort of conservative effort to offer more quote-unquote ballot integrity in the state, what Democrats call voter suppression, that's not happening. You do have the Chick-fil-A bill, which passed, and of course Governor Abbott was very proud about that. I saw him tweeting out, sort of jokingly saying, "You think I'm going to sign that bill? I'll tell you after dinner." And there was a picture of a Chick-fil-A cup there. So these anti-city bills was interesting. With all of the talk about reining in quote-unquote local control, one of the big conservative and business initiatives that was out there, which was to get rid of this government-mandated paid sick leave, telling employers they have to offer paid sick leave. That didn't happen either. So there are a lot of things that are not getting done, and I think there are some conservative groups out there who, as you know, I don't always agree with, but I think might accurately say when it comes to what we were just talking about, actual property tax relief, that's not happening either. So this is a do no harm session, as we talked about previously. It seems that and quote unquote pro-life legislation, right? I mean, you had the Texas Born Alive Act, which passed, which has to do with protecting the lives of babies that are already born. But there are a lot of pro-life activists who say, what about the fetal heartbeat bill and some of these other things that would be, bigger steps? And you have other states that are doing that stuff, Chad, right? I mean, you had, I think, Ohio and Georgia and so some other places that were passing things that are more sort of anti-abortion. Not really happening in Texas. So I think that you, across the state, have seen Tea Party groups and others complaining about Republican leadership not doing enough of the things that those groups want to see, although I think the Republican leadership is looking at the political reality coming up in 2020, and they don't want to have done a whole lot of things that are going to anger folks who are new to the political process. We saw a whole lot of new voters in Texas in 2018, and as you know, a lot of them went for the Democrats last time. And Lieutenant Governor Patrick has been saying, look, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of those people are going to be Democratic voters going forward, especially when you have a lot of people who are just getting involved. Maybe they didn't like Ted Cruz. Maybe they didn't like President Trump and some of the things that he's doing. But that doesn't mean that you give up on those folks and say that we can never convince them to be conservative, convince them to be Republican. You've got to do a lot of outreach to those people who are brand new to the process.
Scott, and we're visiting with Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. And you've been watching the legislature for a long time. And
you mean this year?
Yeah, well, this year, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm a little bleary-eyed.
I understand.
Yeah, for years and years.
Yeah, for years and years and years and years and years and years, you've been watching the legislature. There were some stories that came out this week, and some rumbling that I guess maybe the Chick-fil-A bill. I think it was the Chick-fil-A bill. That got traded for an upvote. Yes, we're not going to tack on all these amendments from the Democrats, and that was traded. And what was traded was basically some conservative legislation, like you brought up. The taxpayer-funded lobbying was killed off, and other bills were killed off. Was there trading that went on there? And if so, was it because you had leadership that just didn't want to upset a voting base coming up?
I think they're operating in an environment that they are just not familiar with. I mean, over at least the last 20 years in this state, maybe a little more than that, the election of consequence has been, as you know, the Republican primary. If you win the Republican primary, you're generally going to win your race, and that's statewide, and that's in most of the legislative districts. In the other legislative districts, it's only the Democratic primary that you have to win. We've only been playing, really on both sides for both parties, primary politics in this state for a generation. I mean, if you're a Democrat and you're running in a Democratic area, you try to be as liberal as you can. If you're a Republican running in a Republican area, you try to be the most conservative candidate, right? I mean, you've seen the mailers, you've seen the TV ads, and all of that. I think that the leadership looked at the results last year, and they think, look, this is either a one-time thing, that there's a confluence of events in 2018 that made the state more competitive for Democrats. They didn't win a statewide race, but they certainly got closer than they ever did. And one of the questions that I'm sure you get all the time is why were people so fired up about this Beto O'Rourke, this guy who is a three-term congressman? Why is anybody thinking this could be somebody who could run for the White House? Which, by the way, I saw that nobody watched his CNN town hall. It seems like of all the candidates, he had the worst ratings. Of course,
he got beat by Hickenlooper.
Yes. So, it's loopmentum, right, or whatever the term is for him. But when you look at the numbers, 5 years ago, Democrats in Texas finished 21 points behind Republicans. Last year, they finished 2 or 3 points behind Republicans, and so the political landscape seems to be shifting. Can you imagine? And I heard this from a Republican friend just the other day. Can you imagine if 4 years ago, Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick, and of course he wasn't Speaker at the time, but Dennis Bonnen, who's always been a pretty conservative guy. Can you imagine that 4 years ago that those three guys, they would look at a budget picture that includes a $9 billion surplus, and what they would do with it is spend all of it? It has always been the message of the Republican Party in this state, as long as I can remember, that fiscal conservatism is number one, right? You don't spend all the money in the bank. You keep some there for, quote-unquote, the rainy day, right? And so we are looking at something completely different. You have the lieutenant governor, arch-conservative, who on the campaign trail promised $10,000 raises to teachers, not the $5,000 that he's been talking about during this legislative session. And you have the Texas House offering a different raise to teachers. But that even the $5,000 is to give every teacher in Texas that much money extra in their paycheck. That accounts for about half of the $9 billion surplus. They're spending every dollar in the bank. And when they talk about school finance, Chad, it's interesting that, for years and years we've heard the argument that, fixing school finance doesn't just mean spending more money, right? It means spending it effectively, putting it right in the classroom, and all of that. And what you see from Republican leadership right now is basically just spending all the money. And so this plan that they've come up with, the plan to spend $9 billion, it works if they have a surplus.
Yeah.
Would it work if they don't have a surplus in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years? I don't know the answer, and I don't think they do either. But I think that everything is sort of being done, in the moment and trying to do what they can now. And we'll come back in 2 years and figure it all out after the next election. But I do think that the leadership is very concerned that the Texas House may end up under the control of the Democrats in 2021, and that's probably why they're acting so cautiously, and why you see conservatives not getting the sort of priority items that are important to them passed at this legislature. And instead, there's a lot of things that are passing with quite a bit of bipartisan support.
Yeah. All right. Before we move on to other things, Scott, we got to talk about beer. One of the big things that passed yesterday, and it was big for a couple of reasons, was beer to go. Talk about that, and then talk about that legislation that passed last night in the Senate.
Well, the TABC sunset bill, all of these agencies in Texas have to be reauthorized every few years, and each of them has a different review process it goes through. The Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission, of course, is the liquor regulator in this state. And if you want to talk about the people who run the world, Chad, it's the liquor regulators in states around the country, because there's big business, around.
Yeah.
And, drinking, people do it whether it's bad times. You drink when you're sad, and you drink when you're happy, when there's a celebration. So sales don't slow down just because of how people feel about the economy or anything else at that moment. Beer to go. This is something that people in this state have been working on for a long time. A few sessions ago, there was a package of legislation that was passed to open up the craft brew industry in this state. You basically had the big beer companies sort of running things. But what happens is these sort of the startups that you see so much craft beer all over the place, and I don't know if you've got a bunch of these up in Lubbock, but they've just popped up everywhere, where people are making their own beer, and these mom and pop shops, if you will, are wanting to be able to sell the beer on site so people can take it with them, beer to go. And that policy change was inserted into the TABC reauthorization, which a lot of people were, pretty encouraged by.
Yeah.
Just because, even if they don't like craft beer, and we were talking about this, it's a silly regulation. You should be able to buy what you want and take it home. But we have had what some people describe as cartels in this state, big beer distributors and the big liquor store owners as well. I mean, one of the other things that's in this bill that is probably historic and not getting as much attention, I say historic because these rules have not been changed since 1949. Since that time, it has been the case that liquor store ownership in Texas is governed in large part by what family you're a member of. Licenses can only be transferred to certain folks who are in certain families. It's created, again, sort of what some folks call cartels, that there are these big, liquor royalty families in this state that own the big liquor stores like Specs and Twin Liquors, for example, and they changed the rules in this bill, which we'll see if it passes all the way through the process, but they changed the rules such that it's going to open things up for folks to own those family ownership rules totally going away.
Scott, we got to get going.
Mm-hmm.
We got to get going. We're up against
it's a huge deal, Chad.
It is. We'll talk about it Tuesday. All right.
Absolutely.
Scott Braddock, CoilReport.com. Thank you.
Thank you.